I'll do it real quick. So first of all, we're very grateful for Mary Evelyn Tucker being here. She's in China, so it's, what did we decide? Is it 8 in the morning there?
Yes.
Now? A little after 8 in the morning. She is the co-director of the Yale Center for Religion and Ecology. I know her, some of the others of you know her from the wonderful Journey of the Universe project. So I think with that, I will let you take it away. Thanks, Mary Evelyn.
Okay, thank you so much. And what a pleasure to be with you all. I wish I could be there in person. And what an amazing lineup you have of speakers, plenaries and panels and so on. So very, very exciting. The topics are quite amazing. So I hope to catch some of them maybe later. But I thought I would share with you something of why we're in China for 5 weeks. And that is ecological civilization, which is a movement that's really 30 years old here in China. And I think very relevant to our thinking, our collective thinking in big history. So if we could have the PowerPoint, we can start.
Working on it. Okay, do you see next slide?
I don't see the slide.
Okay. What is on your screen?
Just IBHA.
Oh, did I not share it? Hang on. I thought I shared it.
It says your screen share.
Share. Do you see it now?
No.
What does that
So
mean?
I have this will stop other screen sharing. Do you want to continue? Should I cancel that? I don't know what.
Yeah, hit cancel.
Okay. Oh, Sam Gonascio says he sees it. I saw it when you first brought it up.
Okay.
Bring up yours so you can see it
Yeah.
in the background.
Yeah.
I'm just temporarily, I'm going to exit the slideshow. Okay, so we still see it. Are you at the top of your screen, do you have a red button that says stop share?
No.
Here it is.
Oh,
now.
there it is now. Well,
Oh.
it was a minute ago.
Okay, all right. Okay, let's try this again. Share. PowerPoint.
There it is.
Okay, you see the title screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, you see slide 1?
Yes.
We're in business.
Okay. That's great. So I'm going to begin with this notion of what is ecological civilization. It's an aspiration for the future, moving in China, especially from an industrial society with unlimited economic growth that's polluting land, air, and water to an ecological civilization that provides a basis for the well-being and health of both people and planet. Now, this is a huge idea, but China has been working on this notion that their industrial revolution is done and that they need now to create the ecological foundations for the future. Because with rapid modernization over the last 75 years, where they've brought millions and millions of people out of poverty, the unintended consequences on air, soil, water, food security, and so on has been incredible, as we know. So in 2012, there were 50,000 riots on the ecological issues, and all of that has led to a sense that the government has to do something, but also on grassroots levels, and we can talk about that. So I think that if you want to go. Yeah. If we have a sense of a billion people, more than a billion people, moving to the next stage of their own vision of themselves, this is what I'm going to be talking about. So next slide.
Really?
So the vision then is from sustainability to flourishing, that there's a need for a broader vision for systemic changes in China. And this idea of ecological civilization is in the Chinese constitution since 2018, namely to promote the coordinated development of material civilization, political civilization, spiritual civilization, social civilization, and ecological civilization. Now, there's probably no country in the world that could put all of that together. We're talking about a 5,000-year-old civilization itself. And China likes to aim big, be inclusive, and so on. But I think the fact that they're including material and spiritual civilization is very notable, political and social and ecological. Again, I think one of the things for environmentalism and environmental movements is that it's usually considered a science and policy-based movement, almost nothing to do with values. And that's something that I'll be talking about in this particular talk. In other words, science, policy, technology, economics, and law, what drive environmentalism and even an understanding of ecology. So this opens it widely, and it also says this is systemic change. It's not just ecological. It's on all fronts. So we can, and the point about using the term from sustainability to flourishing is that, as our teacher Thomas Berry used to say years ago, flourishing is something that's inspiring, that's engaging, that calls us to transformation. Sustainability, I like to say, my husband and our wonderful relationship, it's not just sustainable, it's flourishing. So sustainability, sustainable development, as we know, is a term that maybe has run its course. It will still be used widely, but this notion of flourishing is much more engaging for people, ideas, institutions, and action. Okay, next slide, please. So China's carbon neutral goal in 2020, it was announced that China aims to peak emissions before 2030 and go carbon neutral by 2060 in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement. If accomplished, this would lower the expected rise in global temperature by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees. This is considered the biggest single reduction ever estimated by the Climate Action Tracker. Now, we're putting this in here because to say that China's role in our environmental future, our ecological future, is absolutely critical. I consider it to be the most important country on the planet for these reasons in terms of emissions and so on, but also as a player for the changes. These are complicated changes, and we can certainly talk about them. But we're working closely with a institute at Peking University that's been established for Institute for Climate Neutrality. And this institute understands that values will matter, and that will include values from the Confucian tradition and the traditions of China. So next slide, please. So in short, we're in a major transition, clearly, toward renewable energy in China from unsustainable coal power plants. In 21 of September, they pledged not to build coal-fired power projects abroad. Of course, they're still building them in China. But we know that they're moving towards sustainable solar panels and electric vehicles. China's the world's largest producer of these. We've been coming to China since '85, and you can see the incredible difference in terms of sustainable, shall we say, development. But I want to put into this mix is that it's not just renewable energy of the physical sort, but it's also renewable energy of the human spirit, that a new human energy is clearly needed because we're reviving in China a worldview that promotes a viable planetary future. But this is true around the planet. So the notion of new human energy was a Teilhardian idea between the two world wars, where he saw the lack of, of energy and the existential crisis to be something that needed to be addressed. Okay, next slide. So the paradigm shift that's needed for people on the planet implies shifting from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric worldview in China and the West, namely from a human-focused perspective to an organic, holistic worldview. Again, this sounds maybe large and idealistic, and it is, but it's something that is clearly, I think, in the background of thinking for many, many people, certainly here in China. Okay, next slide. So what is an anthropocosmic worldview? In the Chinese context, it implies a broad paradigm shift from a human-dominating worldview to recovery of an anthropocosmic worldview where humans are situated within the cosmos and Earth. This is needed around the planet, in Asia, in the West, and it's already present clearly in native traditions. Now, big history, of course, has this notion of studying cosmos, Earth, and human. And while I see one of the talks is saying, well, we don't necessarily need that big narrative, we need other kinds of studies and so on. And that certainly is true, but I think it's not an either or. I think a large narrative can be helpful as long as it's not the only narrative. And this is some of the important work, I think, that big history can contribute. So let's go to the next slide. So in China, there's a very long standing notion of harmony with nature, Tianren He, that humans are not independent from the world, but interdependent with the dynamic unfolding forces of heaven, the universe, and Earth. This is compatible with the sciences of evolution and of ecology, as well as with traditional Chinese thought. It fosters an organic holism and harmony of humans with nature in Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. As I say, this is also very compatible with evolution and ecology. So when we show Journey of the Universe here with Chinese subtitles, the students at universities, but also in general public showings, they immediately get this, the dynamic unfolding forces of the universe and Earth, but also our interdependence with them. And we've built in these ideas of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism and the world's religions into Journey of the Universe film and book. Okay, next. So there's a shift that we've been seeing in the Chinese universities and academia. We've been visiting China since 1985, and of course, we've seen many physical changes in terms of the development. It's completely astonishing when one thinks of it. To bring not yet 1 billion people, but millions and millions out of truly abject poverty. In September 2023, we were here for 3 weeks, and we saw the presence of ecological civilization in ideas and in practice. In numerous institutions we visited, from Datong in the north to Pu'er in the south, went to 8 universities. We showed Journey of the Universe, discussed it in relation to institutes for ecological civilization at all of these universities. And as well, the revival of Confucian and Chinese philosophy in general has been a very long and interesting project here in China. It took 10 years to figure out how to reteach it in the schools, and the revival is very much present. It's been about 10 years of teaching it in the secondary schools and in the universities now. So they're very familiar with the major ideas of their own philosophical tradition, which had been pretty much obliterated as a studied tradition from the Cultural Revolution on. But as some of our friends point out, the Confucian tradition is a DNA, a cultural DNA in China. And he's a scientist who works in a very small village here in Yunnan. And he says the Chinese completely still retain their Confucian cultural DNA. So, but its revival in the universities is very much present. Okay, next slide. So our encounter with China and Confucianism, and when I say our, this is John Grimm, my husband, and myself, who've been doing this work for a long, long time together. Our early interest in China was sparked by our teachers, Ted DeBerry and Thomas Berry, They traveled to Beijing in 48 to study Chinese language and culture, especially Confucianism. And then they taught us Chinese traditions at Columbia and at Fordham. We met at Fordham, where Thomas taught, and at Columbia, where I did my PhD with Ted DeBerry. So continue to slides, please. So Thomas Berry, as many of you know, was an extraordinary scholar of the world's religions. We can go to the next slide here. He set up his history of religions program at Fordham University that was non-parallel. He's a specialist in Confucianism and in all the Asian religions. He did a book on Buddhism, one on religions of India. But most importantly, he realized the environmental crisis really in the late 70s and in the 80s when we were working with him. And he encouraged our work in world religions and ecology at Harvard. There's still, I think, no program like it that includes all the world's religions in very specific ways that at that time he also saw as related to the environmental crises. Okay, next slide. So Ted DeBerry was my mentor, and he was my PhD director and so on. An extraordinary person. He was actually a student of my grandfather's, who was a historian of Europe at Columbia, a specialist in nationalism. His last book was Nationalism or Religion. So this lineage of my grandfather in European history, and Ted helped to set up Asian studies really here in the US. Next slide. So he was really the foremost scholar of Neo-Confucianism in the West. He did many, many publications and conferences, a good number of which we were able to participate in. But he helped to create Asian studies in the US because after the Second World War, all the scholars who were involved in the Army and Navy language schools learned Chinese, Japanese, and so on. And they came back and set up courses in many of the universities in the US. And at Columbia in particular, they had courses, year-long courses on the history and literature and culture of China, of India, of Japan, of Korea. These are now courses that are part of their non-Western courses, and 100 students are in many of these courses. He also set up the translations of Asian classics, the sources of Chinese tradition, for example, the bestseller for Columbia Press. So both courses and translations were one of his incredible contributions to Asian studies, because before the Second World War, we simply didn't have enough translations. And I spent many, many years doing translations of 2 Japanese Neo-Confucian texts. Next slide. So another very important figure in this transition of Confucianism and traditional Chinese thought was Winsett Chan, who was also on my dissertation committee. Next slide. He did the source book of Chinese philosophy in '63 and the sources of Chinese tradition with Ted. He did the incredible translation of Zhu Xi, one of the most important thinkers in Neo-Confucianism, and Wang Yangming as well, Instructions for Practical Learning. So every Friday he would come up from Pittsburgh, where he lived, and this was in his 80s and even up into his 90s, for a seminar on Confucianism. And he'd fly back the same day. Amazing dedication to this very complicated tradition, its history, its commentary, sources, and so on. So next slide. And I'm just going to read a tribute to him from Irene Bloom. In the life of Winsett Chan, we've seen one of the most extraordinary examples of a modern-day cross-cultural transmission of the way, the Tao. Winsett Chan, having done more than any scholar in the world to foster that remarkable transmission of the way to the West, was in the closing years of his life engaged in its retransmission back to China, an achievement that made him an altogether worthy successor to his own master, the great 12th century Neo-Confucian Zhu Xi. He was a creator and also a transmitter. Okay, next slide. Now, this transmission continued with Due Ming, who was a good friend of Ted DeBerry and Thomas Berry, and of course, Winsett Chan. And he helped enormously on our conferences at Harvard on the world's religions and ecology. But he was a student of the scholars of Chinese traditions that came out when Mao took over in 49, came out to Hong Kong and Taiwan, and they set up a scholarly work in Confucianism and its relationship to Western philosophy and so on. So by a very thin thread, the intellectual tradition of Confucianism was kept alive by these scholars, a few of them on the mainland as well. But Dui Ming in particular is probably the key international spokesperson on the Confucian tradition and its relevance for today. Next slide. So he's the director here in Peking University at the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies, set up by the Chinese when they realized there was more science and engineering. They were losing the humanistic side. They invited him back in 2000 to set this up. He's still a research professor of the Asian Center at Harvard, where he taught for nearly 20 years. He also taught at Berkeley and Princeton. And we published together 2 volumes on Confucian spirituality with scholars from the US and China. So he's trying to open this tradition so to be seen not just as a ethical tradition, not just as family oriented and so on, but a tradition with a much larger worldview, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, I want to interject here because I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, Confucianism can be autocratic and so on. And my response is that's true. All of the world's religions have their problems, as we know, have their promise, as we also can see. So there's no denying the more controlling side of Confucianism in some of its political manifestations, although its political aspirations were not that way. But of course, that's often how it worked out in practice. So I'm not idealizing Confucianism, but I am trying to link as we go forward here, how Confucianism has a very important role in ecological civilization in terms of the aspirations of a values change. Okay, next slide. So Dui Ming, in a very important article in 2001 from Daedalus, in a issue that we did on religion and ecology, climate change, he was talking about the ecological turn in new Confucian humanism and its implications for China and the world. The new Confucian humanism are these scholars, his teachers, as I mentioned, who came to Hong Kong and Taiwan to set up the more modern form of Confucianism. And here's a quote from that article. By identifying the comprehensive unity of heaven, earth, and humanity as a critical contribution to the modern world, key figures in new Confucian thought signaled the movement toward both retrieval and reappropriation of Confucian ideas. So that's what Dui Ming and other scholars like him are working on. What's a retrieval of this tradition and a reappropriation for modern circumstances? He worked with Ted DeBerry on this for human rights as well for many, many years. Okay, next slide. So one of the key figures in our journey has been Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. As you may know, he was a great inspiration for Journey of the Universe. And he was, as you can see here, a very key thinker and scientist here in China. And let's go to the next slide. So he was a Jesuit paleontologist and geologist of Earth and universe history. His scientific research in China from 26 to 35, and again from 39 to 45, he participated in the discovery of Peking man. And his anthropocosmic ideas inspired many, including our Journey of the Universe film and book, because there's a close link to traditional Chinese thought. And for all these reasons, we led the American Teilhard Association for 40 years. I just want to mention, while we were in Beijing this time for more than a week, giving talks every day, but one Saturday we went over to the Paleontology Museum with a scientist who's also been interested in and influenced by Teilhard. We saw some of the fossils that Teilhard has had discovered, and we saw pictures of the Peking man research. But in particular, there's a very famous scientist here, C.C. Young, who Teilhard worked very, very closely with him. And Young had immense respect for Teilhard and both his scientific studies and his intellectual musings on the universe and its unfolding. So his work in China has been quite extraordinary, not as well known in the West, but very, very important, and important to us, clearly. Okay, next slide. Now, Whitehead is also a figure who's been very important here in China. And next slide, we'll say why. So his contributions as a process philosopher and mathematician is because he has his ideas are similar to dynamic holistic philosophy of Confucianism and Taoism. He's an important philosopher in dialogue between China and the West for ecological civilization. The Center for Process Studies and the Postmodern Development of China, which is based at the Claremont Colleges, has done 17 ecological civilizations conferences, of which we've attended many. The one in 2015 had over 1,000 people there, many leading environmentalists as well, Vandana Shiva, Wes Jackson, Bill McKibben, and so on. And this work has been led by process thinkers John Cobb, Wang Zhehe, and Fang Meijun, who are a couple who've been a great help to us in our travels here in China, and especially in September. So the notion of process thought as a background for ecological civilization is critical because of this work that's been going on since 2006, actually, at Claremont. And conferences here in China. Wang Zhehe is here. We're running a conference. And I should mention that the work that they're doing is quite extraordinary because it ranges from Whiteheadian kindergartens for ecological civilization, which we've visited several times, and all the way up through the university setting and so on. So it's very comprehensive, their work. Okay, next slide. Now, when we come back to China, and Wang and John Cobb, and so they're bridges, of course, because they've had the conferences both in Claremont and in China. But a key figure for us and for all this work has been Pan Yue, who is a very high-level government official here in China and became a friend in 2008. Let's go to the next slide. So at that time, he's been encouraging ecological civilization from 2006. We met him, as I said, in 2008 when he was Vice Minister of China's State Environmental Protection Administration for 13 years. He's now Director of National Ethnic Affairs from June 2022. And we just participated in a conference that he organized on the history and the future of Xinjiang, which is the most furthest west province, the Silk Road and so on, up on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on. So it's a very sensitive area because of the Uyghurs, the minority group, Muslim group, and so on. But that conference was quite extraordinary, and we spoke on ecological civilization, but we also heard a great deal of the history of the Silk Road. We had been on the Silk Road in 1993, but also what its future will be with a more ecologically sustainable development. Now, Pan has promoted a green GDP for a long, long time, many ideas that are barely even in circulation in the West. There's a whole notion of the circular economy is here very much present. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to draw our attention to the fact that he said very early on that environmental laws can't be enforced in China without an environmental culture and values. And of course, that's completely true in the West as well. And so when we met him in 2006, he has a PhD in history. So he's really a Confucian scholar official. He's a literati who's very well educated, but trying to put these things into practice. He's way ahead of his times, and it wasn't always easy with the government, as you can imagine. But most importantly, he had published articles in English even that were translated into English here on Confucianism and ecology, Buddhism and ecology, Taoism and ecology. So this is why we had a very strong connection. and why the books from the Harvard conferences on Confucianism, Taoism, and ecology have been published here in China in Chinese. So let's go to the next slide. So the ecological civilization then depends on cultural values, is the point in terms of the Chinese thinking. Ecological values, clearly from all of the world's religions, can inspire diverse perspectives on environmental ethics. This is true, of course, both in China and the West. The reason we began the Harvard conference series on world religions and ecology, which had 10 conferences and 10 books, as I say, several of them published in Chinese, but was because if we're talking about, we were worried, concerned, those of us in Asian studies back in the 80s, that as China began to modernize, all of us knew the environment would be very much compromised. So that's one of the reasons we started these conferences, to say, well, an environmental ethics in China isn't going to look like a Western ethics of Christianity or Judaism or Islam, or even philosophical ethics of intrinsic value and so on, of some of the great environmental ethicists like Holmes Ralston and Baird Callicott. It's going to have to be indigenous. It's going to have values from China itself. So that's why we began the conferences with actually Confucianism and Buddhism at the very beginning. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So here's this World Religions and Ecology, the book series. And what we were trying to do with Asian religions, Western religions, and indigenous religions, and 800 scholars participated in this, and all the conferences had both the theory of change from examination of the traditions, but also what's the practice, what's the on the ground. So the idea was to retrieval, reevaluation, and reconstruction, as already mentioned with Du Ming. You can take dominion for both Judaism and Christianity, re-examine what that means. There's a robust eco-theology now, as you probably know, saying we need to understand that as stewardship, as care for creation, etc. So all of these traditions are being reevaluated by scholars and practitioners for their ideas and their practices. On our website, we have engaged projects of hundreds of grassroots projects, ranging from indigenous traditions of forest management, fishery management, traditional environmental knowledge, which is now being integrated with Western practices from science. And at our School of the Environment at Yale, there was a webinar this past fall on forest practices from traditional environmental knowledge. 4,000 people signed up for this. So this is a very much a robust movement of the recovery of these types of traditions around the world. And we have courses on Coursera on all the world's religions and their ecological implications. Okay, next slide. So sort of summarizing, coming back to the Confucian holistic worldview and ethics. This is an anthropocosmic, as we've noted, rather than an anthropocentric perspective. It's an organic holism with this unity of cosmos, earth, and human. And I should really underscore this, because the continuity of being, which is one of Du Ming's most republished articles, notes that there's no radical transcendence. This is very, very different from the Western religions of transcendence for a divine theistic God figure. This is a unity of cosmos, earth, and human. Okay, next slide. So it also is a tradition that fosters the dynamic vitalism of material force, or qi. And its comprehensive ecological ethics can certainly be seen in the book, but this human and nature are one is just the umbrella to show that deep interdependence. But the Confucians, were managing farming and agriculture and so on. They had a wealth field system of how you increase agricultural production. They had all kinds of storage systems. They had some of the most sophisticated agricultural irrigation systems in the world, some of which are still in place. So this was, again, a tradition that was working towards how to create a common good for society, not just for individual spiritual enlightenment and so on. But I want to touch on this material force, or qi. I did a translation on the philosophy of qi, which is a kind of another story of the relationship of Li as principle and qi as material force. But the idea of material force or vital energy is, again, a non-dualistic idea that in everything, in plants and trees, in water, clouds, sky, in the land, in humans, there is a vital force. And of course, this is I'm saying it once more, it's not body-mind, it's not matter-spirit, it's a non-dualistic notion, and it's something that's cultivated in the traditional Chinese medicines, in Tai Chi and Qigong, and so on. I've been practicing Qigong for a long time, and utilizing some of these ideas for Chinese massage, et cetera, which have been very beneficial for my own health, but for thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. You see Qigong all the time here in the parks, in the morning and the evening, for health and so on. So these are some of the notions that contribute to a rich ecological, both worldview and ethics. Next slide. So here's one text, a very famous text called the Dashui, the Great Learning, which illustrates this interdependence of the individual and community, because the notion in Chinese thought is the individual is not isolated, but part of a community, and that reciprocal responsibilities to the social and natural communities is just part of who you are. That self-cultivation influences the whole. It's not for salvation, transcendence, for your own well-being. It has a much larger implications. So the notion of concentric circles is that the person is surrounded by family, by society, by education, by a political order, by the earth and the universe in one continuity of being. So all kinds of self-cultivation, which is education, but with a moral force as well, which is why education is so important in East Asia. But the notion is that you are doing it for the good of the larger society, like a pebble that goes into a pond, you affect the concentric circles and so on. And this is true in political philosophy as well as in education, moral philosophy, or social praxis. And by the way, you can really see it still living in China in many ways. The effort to be helpful, to contribute to a common good is very much present, and we can talk about that shortly. Next slide. So I'm going to conclude with a quote from one of the most famous Neo-Confucian philosophers, Zhang Sai, and I'm sure many of you know, we'll go to the next slide, his Western inscription. So this Western inscription says, "Heaven is my father, earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst." Next slide. "Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I consider as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions." Next slide. The sage identifies her character with that of heaven and earth, and the worthy is the most outstanding person. Even those who have no brothers or children, wives or husbands, all are my brothers who are in distress and have no one to turn to. So this is a very comprehensive, as you can see, saying that he wrote on the Western Wall of his study, and has had enormous impact. Everyone knows it if it's quoted. And let's go to the next slide to say why this is important for the modern period too. Because it's a filiality. Filial piety, of course, is very, very important in China, right down to the present. But it's an enlargement towards compassion and care, extended to include the cosmos as father, earth as mother, not simply metaphorically, but in practice. And this is, Journey of the Universe, or any evolutionary narrative has this notion that we've come out of the heavens, we've come out of the cosmos, the stars have created us, the stars are our ancestors. And of course, the earth has produced us as well in terms of evolution over time. So So this is a sense then we would exercise respect for nature, not over-exploitation, clearly. And the Chinese are calling on this even now. And one final text to call on is the Zhengyang, or the doctrine of the mean, which means balance. And this text urges humans to align with the dynamic and nurturing forces of heaven and earth, which I think is a beautiful passage, but it's what we're doing in terms of renewable energy and solar, wind, geothermal, how we align ourselves, which is what Confucian agriculture and praxis tried to do. Chinese praxis is a farming society for years and years, centuries. So this renewable energy, we'll go to the next slide as we conclude here, brings us to a sense of three points that I want to just summarize with, of reciprocity that refers to the importance of working for the common good, not simply for individual gain. In a Chinese context, this implies both individual self-cultivation and communal effort for a flourishing society. So that's the ideal of Confucianism. Again, not always realized in praxis, but let's go to the next one, which is reintegration, which indicates combining knowledge and practice to contribute to the betterment of society. Now, knowledge and practice is very ancient in China and is very, very much present still. That in a Confucian context, this implies educating oneself in practical matters such as science and technology, as well as matters of principles and values in the humanities, which is what Du Ming's trying to do at Beijing University. Okay, next slide. So renewal. So the renewal points to the need for renewable energies for people and the planet in making the transition to ecological civilization and net zero carbon emissions. In a Confucian context, this implies shifting to regenerative energy processes for both the environment and the individual. Okay, last slide. So this is calling us to a shared planetary future. We have the knowledge of science, policy, law, technologies, and economics to make this shift. But we need ecological culture and values to create the context for ecological civilization to flourish in China and in the West. So this is an invitation to join in a mutual effort for the future of the Earth community. And I might say that this notion of we have the science, policy, law, technology, and so on, is why Gus Speth, one of the great leaders in the environmental movement, who founded Natural Resources Defense Council, the law arm of the environmental movement in the US. He founded World Resources Institute, a great policy institute in DC. He was head of the UN Development Program for a number of years. And he's written widely on climate change and so on. But he brought us to Yale after the Harvard conferences to teach about the values of the different world religions and so on, because he felt that's what was missing, that we still have, and we are very close to him still, and that's his view. So what we're trying to suggest is that in China, these values are certainly emerging. We've been giving this talk in China in many different settings, and one from Beijing University, 27,000 people listened to it online, watched it. So there's a growing sensibility that this ideal is already in praxis. People know about it, and they want to implement it in all kinds of very practical ways, from technology to farming, organic farming, and so on. Right now here in Yunnan, we're in Lijian and going to Dali tomorrow. We've been to Yunnan a number of times, which is also way in the west on the border of Tibet. And there's incredible ecological consciousness here in all kinds of ways, eco-communities and other ecological kindergarten and so on, and a very robust, dynamic conversation about the environment and the future of China. So thank you so much for listening, and happy to have some questions, comments, feedback, and whatever's on your mind. Thank you very much.
So let's thank Mary Evelyn. And if there are questions, I know we're at the end of a very long day here, and you're at the beginning of the day, which I kind of love that. Here we go. Sorry, I need to give you the mic. Go ahead, go up there.
Nope. I had him set up a second mic that travels. Yeah,
It's okay. Yeah. New rules.
Okay. Yeah, I found this most interesting, but it was like visiting a museum. That is, the overview of Confucianism and the connection with the environment and nature, I think was very well done. However, it omitted a very important fact of modern China. And that is that there was the Chinese Revolution. And what did the Chinese Revolution consist of? On the one hand, it was a revolution of the Chinese people against their situation. On the other hand, it was an adaptation of the Soviet state. And Mao Zedong really underwent, or he oversaw, excuse me, the transformation of China into a Soviet-type state, where the Communist Party of China proposes and disposes. None of this was addressed, and whatever Du Weiming and the other philosophers have to say about environment or Confucian values, I think can be negated, as Deng Xiaoping did in the Tiananmen affair. That is to say that the state really determines what will be the case for any environmental programs, industrialization, modernization. So in that sense, it's very almost naive or innocent to think that Confucian values will rise to the top and will determine the future of China, when in fact it is Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China which have ultimate power. And if Confucianism is useful, they will bring it up. If it's not useful, they will eliminate it. So I think that Confucianism is, I think it's a wonderful system. I have studied it, and I agree entirely with what you have said about it. But it is subordinated to the interests of the state, so that if industrialization requires, or if it entails pollution, if it entails ecological damage, so be it. This is what the Soviet state did. I think that it's very well to think about, or very well to elucidate on the virtues of Confucianism, which was, I think, the distillation of wisdom from traditional China. And I admire that tremendously. I have read Tiberi and Du Weiming and all the other people that you've mentioned. But I think it's unrealistic to think that the Communist Party will accommodate these kinds of values, particularly if there is any diminishing of the economy. Because as long as the economy grows, the Communist Party can stay in power. If the environmental movement undermines the economic growth, the Communist Party will step in and it will assert its growth values. So I think that you've only given us half a view of China, but thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for your comments, of which I agree with a lot of it. I certainly don't think that the Chinese situation is like the Soviets, that they will just allow massive destruction of the environment. Not at all. And we're giving this talk in China, so I wouldn't be speaking about, some of the issues that you raised. I'm trying to be a cultural diplomat at a time when I think the relations between our two societies are actually disastrous. And the State Department doesn't understand Chinese history, doesn't understand its present. It's continually putting down the Chinese in all kinds of ways that are really unhelpful And so we're trying to, we're not speaking about authoritarianism, which we're fully aware of. We've been to China for many, many years. So I don't deny, your important points. I don't deny a revolution, and so on. But what I am trying to say is, again, very different from the Soviet case, except for Gorbachev, who we went to many conferences where Gorbachev was present, and he was very much trying to shift to an ecological future as well. But I think there's Xi Jinping is whatever we might want to say about him, as you have very clearly, he has put in place this ecological civilization that preceded him, because it developed much earlier than him in China. But they are very, very committed because, as I said early on, 50,000 protests a year on the environment were happening for quite a few years, 50,000 in 2012. They realize it's not just, this is why I mentioned the green GDP. They realize that just growth in and of itself is not going to be the answer. But they're working with many, many complex political realities. But I don't hear anything about sustainable development from our government. I don't see anything about a green GDP. I see a green New Deal in Europe, which has been fought over tremendously, and so on. So, everywhere in the world, we're going to be facing this huge problem of economic growth and environmental protection from 1992 and the Earth Summit and so on. Where Bush from the US said, we're not going to go from the US because we're not going to give up our way of life. So I really appreciate your points, but I think if we don't somehow join hands with an effort that is unparalleled on the planet to say an ecological civilization is necessary, we're going to build it, it's in our Constitution, it's in our universities now. This is nowhere to be found on the planet. And the fact that it has grown this quickly, the irony is in part, pass on the information. We're working with this very extraordinary Wang Binbin at Beijing University, who came to Yale this fall as a World Fellow Scholar. She's been polling the Chinese peoples on climate change for 20 years. 95% of the people in China get climate change. When we spoke at the universities in the fall, they are beside themselves about the future of the planet. They are so worried about it, so concerned. Nowhere in the West is there anywhere close to 95% awareness of that. The UNDP just had a poll that was done by Oxford that says now about 80% of the world's people get it. But the US, we're nowhere close. My point is, if we don't reach out to say that this is an important idea and that China is the most important country on the planet to make this shift towards a flourishing future, we're backing ourselves into a corner and criticizing all of the faults of China, which we understand as well. But I'm saying that I think there's a need for a cultural handshake to the future. And that's what we're trying to do at Yale as well. It's the next generation that gets their future is at grave risk in all kinds of ways. We're at the most critical point in the planet. And ecological civilization, for all its faults and problems, I think has something to offer, as long as we're clear and aware and realistic in the ways that I think you have pointed out fairly and appropriately. So I thank you for the comment.
Hi, Mary Ellen. It's Lowell Gustafson. Thank you so much for your excellent, as always, presentation, and in fact, for your life's work. It's incredibly inspiring and valuable. I guess I've two things, a number of things on my mind. I'll only mention one of them. You mentioned a series of books on great world religions and ecology, which is a striking series. Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and so on, each one of them in an ecological dialogue. And then, of course, you also were mentioning anthropocosmos ideas rather than anthropocentric. ideas. And I wonder if your Journey of the Universe project points to something beyond both of those. That they're not just trying to comment on existing world religions, they're thinking of what the journey of the universe would mean for a new cosmic thinking about whatever we mean by religion, and even something beyond humanity. We've only been around for 300,000 years after 13.82 billion. We're not the last of the creations of the universe. Are you really thinking about ecology, about thinking about a series of values beyond, without negating existing human religions or world religions, or without diminishing the importance of the human experience, that you're really thinking beyond those?
That's a terrific question. Also, I thank you for it. And you're right. I think it's very perceptive. So, we did for 3 years these conferences at Harvard, and for 7 years we helped to publish these books. And now, by the way, there is a field of religion and ecology in North America. There's 25 graduate programs in religion and ecology, mostly masters, but 3 PhD programs. So a new field has been created because of interest of many, many people in this sense of values and ecology. And I would definitely agree. We also have a series on ecology and justice, talking about what's happened in Latin America and the Amazon, and the risks that people are taking for protection of these places around the world. But I very much agree that Journey of the Universe is definitely an attempt to synthesize many religious worldviews into a cosmological story, and to say that we need a cosmological story that will inspire action. So awe and action go together. So you're right in following this work in that way. But I especially like that you're pointing to, is there something even beyond the religions and so on per se? And so on our website, the Forum on Religion and Ecology website, we've created, by the way, an ecological civilization website, just launched a couple of weeks ago, and we'll send you the link to that and so on. But more importantly, what we're working on is what we're calling ecological spirituality, which I'm sure many of you would agree is absolutely booming in many, many parts of the planet. We see it here in Yunnan and so on. So it's something that you could say transcends religions. We all know the institutional parts of religions have tremendous problems and so on. But I think that there's, in this critical crisis moment on our planet, and with so many mental health issues since COVID and even before, and eco-anxiety, climate grief, we see it in our students and so on. But there's this reaching out of people to a deepening relationship with the natural world. I mean, forest bathing and all of these kinds of practices that are emerging, meditations in nature, et cetera. And we're we have a huge umbrella now of many of these topics. It's gargantuan. It's quite astonishing. So we're going to put something up of this much broader ecological civilization that I think, ecological spirituality that has a deep appeal for the next generation who wants to move beyond traditional religions. But all are needed. We're not saying Confucianism is the answer. And that's why Confucianism has to be in touch with ecology in a very realistic way. But anyway, I thank you for your question. I think it's very insightful. And hopefully we're just going to map the territory as we see it. And hopefully other people will add to it. Books, films, et cetera. It's enormous. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me just check one thing. We're almost out of time. We're probably a little over time. Did anyone online, if someone online wants to ask a question, Hero, did you can unmute yourself and ask. Hero, I see your hands raised.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I have learned and agreed much from your presentation. And I agree with the anthropocosmic worldview, and because I suspect big historian has complexity-oriented big history has some anthropocentric moment. So
Mhm.
I protest this trend, and I have proposed Buddhist big history,
Mhm.
and so I agree with your opinion. And I would like I would like to ask you is what is your attitude to accelerationism? Because you turned your eyes to traditions and and in my word, deep time identity of humans. But and today's and the thought of accelerationism is has some power, even in our big historians. So, in my opinion, and not not a few big historians are influenced from accelerationist thinking. So, but I am concerned about this accelerationism's situational identity and very ephemeral and thinking. So, and I would like I would like to ask you, what do you think about the great acceleration phenomena and thought of accelerationism?
If I'm understanding, Hero, you're saying relationism and actual relationality. Is that what you're saying? I
Uh,
wasn't sure about the term.
and modern times and for example, technological developments and
Yeah.
other things is more and more accelerated. And some people say, and we use this accelerationism to transhumanism
Uh-huh.
and and this and crisis of Earth, we overcome it by accelerating technology.
I see. Yes. Thank you. That's an excellent question also. Um, well, I have what I hear your skepticism maybe, and I share that skepticism deeply. So, that would be my short answer, and I'll try and keep it short because you're all have had a long day. I don't think I haven't explored transhumanism enough to make a full response. But I think in so many of these things, technology is necessary but not sufficient, right? And the sense that we're going to move our energy to something that's flourishing and sustainable, we need technologies and some, but we need appropriate technologies, alternative technologies, just like geoengineering for the future of climate change is disastrous. Many, many scientists we know are deeply worried about that. AI, some of it can be helpful, some of it is clearly very harmful, and all of the things that have happened on the internet to foster hate speech and et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to have a very healthy skepticism about technology and its uses, and where we can have some ethics coming into the picture. It's really Pandora's box. It's already let out of the genie's let out. But this is why I think, Teilhard was so important, and Thomas Berry is clearly so important in today's world. Several of his books have been translated into Chinese. They're responding very, very well because Thomas had this idea, as you all know, of the universe and the earth is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. And that's where the last question, we're moving deeper into this sensibility that this communion of subjects and human relationality is absolutely critical. I'm here with John in China. I couldn't do this work without John. I feel so grateful for the companionship, intellectual and otherwise. But the communion, as you've also noted, we've got to go beyond anthropocentrism. So what is a communion with the earth that's emerging right now in our times, as well as with the universe? I think it's this crisis moment that's emerging with great creativity and communion. And that, with the natural systems, is what's going to re-energize the human spirit. And I think big history has so much to contribute to this. And I congratulate you all. Again, the panels are outstanding as I can see them. And I really wish you well in the future of this conference the next day or two. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening late at night, and all the best in the next few days.
All right, thank you. I think we better stop there.
Ask one question, very simple.
All right, very quick.
Well, yes or no?
Okay.
He's never.
We're gonna be ready.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, having focus and clarity. Wow, my mind's all over the place. Look, my name is Sohan Cheetah. I'm from the UK. I run a group, two groups. One of them is called Network Researchers on the Chemical Emergence of Life. That's the parent group. The other group is Blue Earth Project, to which my friend Lowell has spoken at. I'd like to invite you to Leeds to come and talk in 26, because 25 slot is full. Sorry about this. I'm really sorry putting you on kind of an uncomfortable position. Will you come, please?
We'll let you think about that for a little.
I mean, but by the way, we'll pay for your airfare and we'll put you in a nice hotel, treat you to good food, and show you around Leeds. How did that grab you?
It sounds very, very inviting, and I thank you.
By the way,
Yeah, we have to stop. We're gonna stop. So let's once again thank Mary Evelyn for a really.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good night. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Mary Evelyn. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Todd, for your help, and all of you. Thanks.